So whatever camera you've found, bought or borrowed, if you're a beginner, you need to learn how to use the basic functions so you can begin to experiment with it. Now, every camera will be different and you'll be able to find an in-depth guide online for yours, but here are some general tips for the basic camera settings. First up, no matter what you're filming on, for the best results, always switch to manual mode if you can, instead of auto. This will usually be marked with an M on most DSLR or mirrorless cameras. Now set your resolution. I would recommend shooting at least in full HD, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels, and these settings are normally marked in your menu with FHD or 1080p. On some cameras you can choose UHD, Ultra HD or 4K, which is twice the size of HD, or even higher settings like 6K, 8K and beyond, but these will create much bigger files and make your editing take longer unless you have a very fast computer. So HD is still perfectly fine for most uses and gives a perfectly good image. The next number to look at, which is sometimes next to the resolution, is frames per second, which is sometimes called FPS, and this means how many still images the camera will be taking per second. Now, depending on what country you are in, you might see some different numbers, as most countries either fall under a region called NTSC or a region called PAL. NTSC countries like the USA will often give you frame rate options like 24, 30 and 60, while PAL countries like the UK and most of Europe will give you options like 24, 25 and 50. The good news though is that nowadays a lot of cameras have an option to switch between these two region settings, and this might be under a menu option called NTSC and PAL, or perhaps region. So this no longer locks you in to just one method or the other. For a cinematic look, most people will choose 24 frames, as this is what is used in Hollywood films, and 25 looks pretty similar. 30 frames or higher frame rates than that usually look cheaper and more like home video, so I would avoid these unless you're doing a found footage film and you want that home video look, or if you're using high frame rates for slow motion. Now, when doing slow motion, you can shoot at a higher frame rate, such as 60 frames, and then when you edit, you can play this back at your normal speed, such as 24 frames, and the whole shot will stretch out longer and so appear slower. But for regular filming at normal speed, I would go for 24 or 25 frames to get a nice result. Be aware that most cameras will have a trade-off in resolution versus frame rate. So for example, you might be able to shoot at 60 frames per second at 1080, but only 30 frames at 4K. So always look up your camera's specs if you want to see what frame rate you can do at what resolution. Also, sometimes these frame rates are written with a decimal point, so it will say 5994 instead of 60, or 23.976 instead of 24, but it will give you something that basically looks the same. So if you're seeing that instead of full numbers, then don't worry. Next, look at white balance. This is setting what the camera sees as white, and this affects all the other colors. This is because our eyes are so clever that they do this automatically, but cameras need to be told what white is. So the goal here is to make your white look white, and you'll get natural colors in all your shots instead of maybe looking too warm or too cool. So find something to point the camera at that is white in the place where you're going to be filming and with the light you have to film, and press the white balance button if your camera has this to set it, or toggle between the various white balance presets until you have one that looks most like real life. Or there's usually a custom mode where you can set this manually. You'll most likely want to use a daylight preset if you are outside being lit by the sun, or the tungsten setting, or perhaps the fluorescent setting if you are indoors being lit by artificial light. But every time you film in a new location, always check the white balance still looks natural. If all else fails, you can use auto white balance, but if the light changes, this will change as well. So I would avoid auto white balance if possible. Next, you'll need to set your exposure. Now, this is how much light is being let into the camera. Your image can be too underexposed, meaning too dark, or too overexposed, meaning too bright. So you want to get it somewhere in the middle where the scene looks natural and is just right. Exposure is controlled by three settings: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The aperture is the number with a decimal point that you can probably see on your screen, which is also called the f number or f-stop. And this setting opens and closes the front of the lens to let more or less light in. And every time you change it, you are altering it by one stop. And what aperture settings you have will depend on what lens you are using. The aperture also controls your depth of field, which means how much background or foreground blur your subject will have. The lower the number, the less of your shot will be in focus, which normally means more background blur if you are filming an actor, and the brighter your image will get because lots of light is being let into the lens. And the higher that number, the more of your shot will be in focus and the darker your image will get, because very little light is being let into the lens. So when we say something is shallow focus, it means there is lots of background blur, and this is an attractive look you see in most films for shots of actors, as it puts all of your attention on them. When we say something is deep focus, it means the opposite. It means that everything in the frame looks sharp at once, the foreground, the midground, and the background. And you can often see this in famous older films like Citizen Kane. So that is aperture. Next we have shutter speed. Now this will be one of the other numbers you can usually see on your screen. Shutter speed controls your motion blur. The lower the number, the blurrier moving things in your image will be, and the more light it will let in. The higher the number, the less motion blur you will see, and any movement in your shot will look more sharp in every single frame. For normal filming, the rule is to set your shutter speed at double your frame rate if you want your motion blur to look natural, just like our eyes see it. So if you're shooting at 24 or 25 frames per second, then the closest setting for your shutter speed is 50. For filming a fast action scene though, where you might want less motion blur, you'd normally crank up your shutter speed a bit, and that will give you those crisper edges. And you see this a lot in action films. Finally, there is the ISO, and this is basically artificial brightness that you can add to your image if it's too dark due to a lack of available light, or the way you've set the other settings like the aperture and the shutter speed. ISO can be very useful to brighten a dark scene, but you should try and keep this number as low as you can, because the higher you set it, the grainier and more fuzzy the image will look. Now during the day or when outdoors in bright light, you can keep this number low, but beware if you're filming at night or in low light and you try and increase this number really high to try and brighten your image. It's much better to keep it as low as you can and do some extra lighting if you're filming a dark scene, if you're able to. So those three settings, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, all work together to determine the exposure of your image. You can either try judging exposure by eye, or you can perhaps use a tool in your camera like a histogram. This will show you with a graph when your image is too underexposed or too overexposed. And as you change your settings, you'll see the white area move around on the graph. If it's in the middle without touching either end, then you know you've got your exposure just right. Now you might have a situation, especially when you're filming outside, where you've set your exposure nice and low to get that blurry background, and you've set your shutter to 50 in order to get natural looking motion blur, but the image is far too overexposed and you can barely see anything. Now you could solve this by stopping down with the aperture, but then you would lose your nice background blur and you'd bring everything into focus, which you might not want to do. You could also fix it with your shutter speed by increasing it, but this will of course take away your nice motion blur and make the scene look very choppy and unnatural. So the answer is, in this case, you would probably use a filter on the front of your camera. And on big films, they do this with what's called a matte box. And this is a box that allows them to slide in and out different glass filters. These are called ND or neutral density filters. And this is basically like adding sunglasses to the front of your camera to cut down the light coming in. And it allows you to shoot with the low aperture and that correct shutter setting that you probably want, but even in bright light. Documentary or fixed lens cameras often have their own ND filters built in, which can be really handy. But for shooting on DSLR or mirrorless cameras, you'll probably need to buy a separate ND filter which screws onto the front of your lens. If you get a variable ND filter, this will be adjustable if you twist it, so these are very, very useful, though be careful, especially with wide lenses, that you don't get some vignetting or darkening around your edge. You will also need to look on your lens for the thread size when finding the right filter, and this is usually printed around the rim of the lens at the front. But that has been a quick look at camera settings.